Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among this week's news items, we have information coming from Russia about a new form of influenza. There are approvals and issues with a number of vaccines being released or approved at the moment. There have also been some bizarre animal observations. These and other news items will be covered in this video. To start with, politicians are promoting vaccine uptake, particularly for the CCP virus, but others as well. This has led to certain individuals who are perhaps more attractive to different demographics appearing in the media more frequently. This has created something of a, not quite a meme, but a trope. That is, attractive male ministers for the government are receiving the vaccine very publicly and in front of the media. This has led to a not insignificant amount of attention, largely from females. It's not an uncommon phenomenon, and certainly not one that we haven't seen elsewhere for different reasons, but it's an interesting phenomenon, considering the various issues had with the sexualization of women. You would think treating men this way would be seen as a unequal or inopportune way to go about things, but such is life, we suppose. A good example being that of the French Health Minister Olivier Véran. Perhaps the funniest idea of all is the idea of creating a calendar with politicians who are attractive and receive their vaccine on it. At least it would have some use in the further support and continuation of CCP-based research. While on the topic of research, there are several vaccine-related pieces of news that are less or more impressive depending on how you want to look at them. The first of these is the confirmation of the Johnson Johnson vaccine. The confirmation comes on the heels of an application for not only an emergency approval, but a longer-term standard approval. This is based on their clinical trial data. In short, the vaccine has been found to be effective in preventing severe cases. More advantageous than other vaccines is that it is a single-dose vaccine. The others all require 2 doses. While one of them can be stored at a standard freezer temperature, the other requires specialized facilities. That means you need a lot more room to provide the other 2 vaccines that are available. This is one advantage the Johnson Johnson has. The downside, so to speak, with this vaccine, as opposed to the other 2, is that it is 85% effective. The others are in the mid to high 90s, so we're not talking about a massive trade-off here, but still, that's a drop from the performance of the other 2. When looking at their vaccine from a pure logistics point of view, it has a lot of things going in its favor over the competition. First and foremost, it can be stored in a refrigerator and does not require a freezer. It also has a 3-month shelf life in that freezer. When you combine this with the fact that it is a single-dose regime, it means it can be distributed far more effectively for the volume and amount shipped. If looking at this purely from a value point of view, the Johnson Johnson vaccine appears to be a better option. The downside to this is that it is nowhere near as effective in moderate to mild symptoms, particularly those over 60. It was about 42% effective in reducing these moderate to mild symptoms, and that's a bit of a concern. Admittedly, the age bracket at most risk, and therefore the ones most in need of being vaccinated, are in this bracket as well. Swinging to the positive side yet again, the vaccine was surprisingly effective against the South African variant and has had less of a drop-off than the competition. This means, at least in theory, it might have better longer-term support and efficacy when compared to them. While the Johnson Johnson vaccine has a lot of things going for it, it's not yet been approved, although it looks likely based on the FDA statements. That's almost a certain thing. What else is interesting coming from the FDA is that the modification to Pfizer's regulations and opinion as to how it can be safely stored. Previously, the Pfizer vaccine was one of the most difficult to transport as it had to be stored at up to negative 80 degrees Celsius, a temperature that is almost unachievable for anything but laboratory grade equipment. This is, rather obviously, a big problem. This leads to the FDA update. The update lists a big change. The big change being that you now don't require laboratory grade freezers, but rather ones that would be commonly found in pharmacies. These are freezers that get down to about minus 20 degrees Celsius, a far more achievable measure than what minus 80 would be. This does not appear to grossly affect the duration or longevity of the vaccine in storage. That means, at least in theory, it increases the logistical capacity to deploy and distribute the vaccine more so than what was seen before now. This, of course, doesn't change the final result. Once you have thawed the vial of the vaccine, it needs to be used within 5 days and kept in a fridge at around 2 to 8 degrees Celsius. That problem still hasn't been addressed, as 5 days, depending on how much is being used, and has been mentioned previously, could even then be not enough time. One of the other Pfizer-related pieces of news is going to make the anti-vaxxers and some of the other ardent opponents of the measures taken to control the CCP virus very unhappy. A study involving 1.2 million people in Israel is the largest and earliest running study of how immunization for the CCP virus works. To spoil the ending, it's effective, and quite so. Although not quite as effective as you might want at 100%, it is 94% effective. This is in line with other vaccines that have been used to eradicate other diseases. It stands to reason then that Israel and any country that follows a similar vaccination system will be in good standing in the near future. The study ran from late December to the start of February. In this time, Israel also had issues with the new variants of the CCP virus spreading. This means that if the Pfizer vaccine performs at 94% efficacy despite new variants, it's going to be very effective in those countries that have a good handle on their outbreaks. This study is very robust, primarily because they used a matched group of individuals. That is, for each person who had a variety of characteristics, they would take an unvaccinated control person. That is, they had to be of a roughly similar age, the same sex, same geographical region, medical history, and a range of other characteristics. These are important to be able to show that people in Group A with the vaccination are performing much better than people in Group B without the vaccination. This is especially true when we're looking at very large studies like this, over 1 million people. Perhaps the biggest finding, and understand there are quite a few, the one we want to focus on here is that those who received a second dose of the vaccine had a 92% lower chance of getting any infection at all. This means, at least in theory, the Pfizer vaccine, if you get both doses, provides a very robust protection and could drastically curtail the spread of the CCP virus if it is deployed on a large enough scale to generate the herd immunity that most immunologists and scientists are hoping for. On the other side of the coin for vaccines, we need to go to Indonesia. Indonesia's been one of those countries that's taken an interesting approach to their vaccine schedule, primarily choosing to rely at the moment on China's Sinovac vaccine. This is the vaccine we mentioned that had more than 70 side effects listed, enough that in most countries it would have been rejected. Well, Indonesia has chosen to go with China's vaccine anyway, or one of the vaccines they're issuing. This led to what can only be described as a very unfortunate event. A nurse working there died 9 days after they received their dose of the vaccine. This is somewhat unpleasant and can be used to create alarm unnecessarily. What we want to make clear is that between receiving the first dose of the vaccine and the second dose, she contracted the CCP virus. When given the second dose of the vaccine, it initiated an immune response. This led to fever, then shortness of breath, and a cough. This is when they found out that she had tested positive for the CCP virus. This one unfortunate case study contrasts very starkly to that of Israel's study, primarily because it is a single instance of an unknown cause of mortality. Even the health ministry and hospital has stated that it's not clear whether or not she died as a result of the vaccine or due to some other cause such as the CCP virus. This means that although, yes, it may be touted as an example of the danger of vaccines, those who do so do not know what they're talking about. The story at hand does raise secondary issues that should be mentioned in conjunction with any Chinese vaccine. China's vaccine market is particularly notorious. They have had historical instances of vaccines that have caused a whole raft of issues and led to a massive surge in anti-vaxxer sentimentality in China. Further to this, China itself at times has issues with corruption. This means that any large company has at least some degree of corruption within it. Inevitably, this has found its way into the vaccine market as well. This leads to instances, let's say, where vaccines are not made to standard. In fact, in some cases, there can be many issues with just how exactly a vaccine gets approved, leading to what can be, for lack of a better word, described as scams in an attempt to sell what is nothing more than saline in a bottle as a vaccine. Combine that with the just over 50% efficacy of the other Chinese vaccine, and you can see why there might be some issues. Now for a case study that's also looking at the CCP virus. This time, far sadder news though. A baby was born with CCP virus. This in and of itself is novel and depressing. We've seen instances of where children were born but had been given the antibodies to the virus when the mother had been infected during gestation. They themselves had not been infected. To the best of our knowledge, this is a first. Somewhat more importantly to just being the first to be infected with the virus, the infant had a viral load more than 51,000 times higher than comparable young patients. It was also a new variant of the CCP virus. These two features are very disconcerting. Of course, this could just be coincidence, but looking at what we've seen previously, drastic increase in viral load and new variant, the chances of the two being related are quite high. Going now from New York to California once more, where we continue to beat on that particular state for many reasons. The newest happens to be yet another American variant of the CCP virus. Yes, yet another. The UK, South Africa, Brazil, they were all happy with one, but America must be number one and instead has two new variants at least. This one comes out of California, and it's a concern to say the least. The UK variant was spreading throughout America, and it was more or less doubling every 10 days. This new variant is doubling every 18 days. It was also 40% better at infecting people. That's a big concern, where previously with at least the UK variant, we weren't concerned about that because it was effective at being neutralized by vaccines. The concern here is that the Californian variant is not responding the same way. So while not as infectious as the UK variant, it's also not responding to the vaccine. You might see where this is going. It's already more infectious than the original, it doesn't respond to vaccines, and further evidence would indicate that it is more deadly. Oh, America, you must be number one at something. In other American CCP virus-related news, yet another vector for infection has been not necessarily discovered, but conclusively identified. An American woman received a double lung transplant last year. From this lung transplant, she contracted the CCP virus. The CCP virus naturally led to her death, as she had already been severely injured, let's say, by the transplant process. This, plus the introduction of immunosuppressants, led to the rather tragic death. This occurred despite having tested both the donor and recipient for the CCP virus. The problem being presented here is not just the tragic death, but the fact that the process of transplanting the lungs from one individual to another led to the surgeon being infected as well. This shows that despite best efforts to try and contain the virus, that it can easily spread a number of ways that you just wouldn't expect and think of until they happen. Perhaps the biggest piece of positive news to come out of the United States of America is that because of the CCP virus, the seasonal flu has effectively disappeared, although you could argue that perhaps the CCP virus is the new annual influenza strain. The CCP virus, whether through the control measures put in place to curtail it, greater personal hygiene, or more awareness of simply being sick, has led to a drastic reduction in the number of people who have been infected. It's also possible that the CCP virus in and of itself, because of how prevalent it has become, simply supplanted the annual influenza virus. This means that the current numbers are the lowest that have been on record for more than 25 years. That's a big achievement and something that would normally be a cause for celebration. Some doctors are reporting 0 cases of influenza. 0. To put this in a more concrete context, the CDC keeps particular note of children who die from influenza. This is a good indication of how serious it is. There has been 1 pediatric death due to influenza versus the more normal 92. That is a fraction over 1% of the average from last year. 1% of the flu-related deaths in children. This is also being seen in CDC data overall. With the 190 million flu vaccine doses distributed for this season, normally the CDC can get an idea as to what's happening based on the presentations to hospitals and other medical factors. They're not getting that information, not because it's not being provided, but because there aren't enough cases. Again, normally a cause for celebration, but given the circumstances under which it's occurring, that's not exactly the case. This may have longer-term effects on everything else, particularly development of future vaccines, which normally begin more than a year before they're required. While still on the topic of influenza, we need to talk about the news coming from Russia. They have announced the first case in the world of the H5N8 avian influenza strain moving from birds to humans. The last time we had a major shift of avian influenza from birds to humans, it wasn't good, to say the least. Right now, people are probably more occupied with the CCP virus, but this could be the next big problem that's going to come around. This particular strain of influenza is lethal to birds, but it hadn't yet been seen moving to humans. That's not uncommon. Normally it takes time and an intermediary species for a disease to move like that. That's exactly what's been theorized for the CCP virus. Somehow the disease went from bats or pangolins to an intermediary species and then humans. The concern will be whether or not the virus can now move not only from birds to humans, but between humans. If that happens, then we have a new influenza strain to be concerned about. At the moment, as far as the health workers can tell, the Russian workers who were exposed were asymptomatic and did not spread the disease between each other. Going now from virus-related news to therapy-related news. There have been a number of controversial treatments throughout recent years. Whether we look at the CRISPR modification of embryos by Dr. He, through to far less controversial but certainly unproven medications such as hydroxychloroquine. A controversy going back even further is the use of stem cells. Stem cells have been thought to be an effective way to resolve issues, particularly around tissues that don't continue to grow after they achieve their particular size or purpose. Cardiac and nerve cells being good examples. This obviously has a bit of an issue if you wind up with a spinal cord injury. This is where a test of this with patients comes in. It involved 13 patients in a Phase 2 clinical trial. They were based in Japan and had experienced severe spinal cord injury. In order to treat it, they were given an infusion of their own stem cells derived from bone marrow, and from this they experienced some improvement. While none of the participants had had their spinal cord severed, there was considerable damage there anyway. Of those who took part, most found that they had improvement in sensory and motor function by 6 months. Over half had substantial improvement in their ability to walk or use their hands. This is a big thing because there were no adverse effects reported. This, of course, does have certain caveats that need to be stated, if nothing else. The first and most obvious is that it is a small trial. 13 people is not a treatment in the making, it's a proof of concept. Going now to animal-related news. There was a recent image being circulated, that of a deer with an eyeball covered in fur. You might think that, well, it's an eyeball, it's probably just the eyelid. But no, this was the eyeball proper. It had skin growing over both of the corneas, and this then had fur growing out of it. If you've seen this image, you might have heard many different explanations. We can provide you with the simplest and most accurate here. That being, it's something called a corneal dermoid. This is a tumor, and the tumor is made up of cells, and mostly cells that turn into a tissue from another part of the body. In this case, the skin tissue with its hair follicles. This obviously leads to skin on the eye, which develops fur, and the fur is not particularly functional. Well, not functional as an eye at least. It's perfectly fine as skin. This obviously would create problems for the animal surviving in the long term. Finally, in an update to last week's news about Facebook and other social media companies, Facebook claims to have reached an agreement with the Australian government regarding media publications and Facebook's ability to distribute links. Apparently, they have reached an agreement in which the Australian government is willing to allow only some media organisations to require payment. As they put it, those that contribute mostly to their country and have significant impact. They're also giving Facebook considerably more time to organise these arrangements as to what they will and will not pay for the sharing of links and articles. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.